Today is Sunday, October 8th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that you're enjoying a beautiful fall day like we are here in North Carolina. This morning at Mass, we enjoyed two readings, one from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament, that I think really offer comfort to Catholic parents. St. Paul, writing in the New Testament, says, "Be imitators of God." And therefore, one of the benefits of studying sacred scripture is that we learn how God acts so that we can imitate God's way of acting when we face similar situations. We can learn to imitate God, to be imitators of God. And today's reading gives us good examples of what that looks like. And these examples apply to parenting. After all, when we get into parenting, particularly as fathers, we enter into a very unique relationship with God since we're fellow fathers. And we can always look to God's example to show us how to be good fathers. So we read this morning in the Old Testament reading from the prophet Isaiah, and I'm just paraphrasing this. I don't have the text in front of me, just going by memory. The prophet Isaiah speaks of a vineyard. And he says, and again, this is a paraphrase, so don't hold me accountable too strictly to the words. I just want to focus on the images. He says, a friend had a vineyard, and he cleared the land, hoed the ground, plowed, did everything that was necessary to be done. Planted, he says, choice vines, so got good plants, made sure there was nothing faulty in the vines that he planted. Did everything that was necessary, did all of the work, all of the normal work necessary for a successful vineyard, he did. And then he waited for the harvest. And when the harvest came, or when the growth manifested itself, it produced wild grapes, that is, grapes of a quality that wasn't appropriate for the cultivation. It produced fruit that was not the fruit desired, and was not the fruit that he deserved for the work that he had done. And so he says, what else am I supposed to do? I did everything that I'm supposed to do. I did all of the normal tasks that are required. I did everything the right way. I did everything that men do who produce the finest grapes in other vineyards. But for some reason, my vineyard did not bear fruit. And God says, in very simple terms, it's not my fault. I did what I was supposed to do, and the fruit is not what it was supposed to be. And there's nothing else for me to do except accept this reality and move on. And so he says, what I'm going to do is just get rid of these vines. I'm not going to continue working on them because, like Jesus says, in a little bit different illustration, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and these vines have produced bad fruit. So I'm just going to get rid of them. It's very interesting to see God arguing that he did what he was supposed to do, and the outcome was not his fault. And when we take that example from the scriptures, and remember that St. Paul says, be imitators of God, we learn from that passage in the prophet Isaiah that it's possible for us in our own lives to do what we're supposed to do, have outcomes that we are not the cause of, and it's perfectly okay in such a situation to say, it's not my fault. What else was I supposed to do? I did everything that was necessary, and the outcome was not what I desired. That's life. We see that even God says this about some things, and of course in the context of the prophet Isaiah, he was referring to the people of Israel as his vineyard, and he's saying, look at what I did for the people of Israel. There's nothing more that I could have done. Considering what I did for them, how I cared for them, how I taught them, how I provided for them, they should have borne me the most excellent fruit. And yet I have among them the same undesirable fruit found among the nations. So this is literally God speaking of his relationship with his own children. And it therefore becomes a pattern for us to learn from and imitate. In parenting, it is certainly possible to do everything that you're supposed to do and have the outcome be undesirable. That is true even for God himself. And if it's true for God himself, it's certainly true for us. Then in the New Testament, this morning in the Gospel reading, we read the same thing. Go ahead, you guys can write, it's okay. Go ahead. In the Gospel reading this morning, we read the same thing. Jesus tells almost the same exact parable, but says that God intends to give the vineyard to someone else, or to choose someone else, someone who will bear the desired fruits. Both parables tell the same story of a of a farmer who does everything he's supposed to do, but doesn't get the fruit that his work deserves. And we learn this lesson. We learn this lesson that it's possible to do what is right and necessary and have the outcome be something other than what was desired. And it's through no fault of the one working. It's just the way it is. And when we look at the Old Testament history of Israel, this is why it's so crucial for the Christian life for us to study and meditate on the history of Israel, because we get to see God acting like a father as the head of a household, and how the children respond to him, and how he responds to the children, and what he does. And we see in the fact that there will be people in hell, we see that many of God's children, regardless of how perfectly wise and good and holy God may be, reject him and die in a state of rejection. And therefore, if and when we experience this as parents, it's perfectly just for us to say, what else could I do? What else was there for me to do? I did everything I was supposed to do. Now that may lead us to the question, well, what exactly am I supposed to do? And I would argue that this is a question that most parents can't answer. We have to know, just as we read in those two scripture passages, there's a list of things to do. There's a list of tasks that need to be done. And if those tasks were not done, or if, let's say, there were 7 tasks that needed to be done, and the worker only did 6, or he did other tasks that weren't included in that list of necessary tasks, well, then he couldn't say, what else could I do? Because we would be able to easily answer that and say, look, dummy, you forgot step 6. But that's not the case. We have an objective list of measurable duties that are required for the production of good fruits. And he says, look, here's my list of tasks. Every single task is checked. You can inspect it for yourself. Look at my list of tasks. Is that not the list of tasks? Is that not the list of what needs to be done? Come and look. Have I not done each of those things? And we can see that the farmer in that parable has a clear conscience. He knows what he was supposed to do, and he knows that he did it. It's another important aspect of parenting that gets neglected. How does one live with a clear conscience when bad results are experienced? The answer is one has to know what his duties are, and he has to know that he fulfilled those duties. And like I said, most Catholic parents don't know that. Now, if you're interested in digging into that a little bit, a while back, I did a talk with my wife, actually, and we made an article out of it on the Academy website titled The Duties of Catholic Parents. And what we did was we read through all of the passages in the Catechism of the Catholic Church that talk about the duties of parents. And we just gathered out of the Catechism a list of duties of parents that are given in the Catechism. And we made that list, and it came out to, I think, 27 duties, 27 things parents need to do. And it's an objective list of measurable tasks, just like the list of tasks in the scripture readings. And I went through them, and I made a list of them. I put them into a document so you can have on a sheet of paper this checklist of 27 duties of Catholic parents. I recommend you check that out. You can go to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, classicalliberarts.com, and then I don't know if there's a link to it on one of the side menus, but you can just click on the search tool in the menu and just type duties of Catholic parents, and I trust that you'll find that article. It's very helpful because you can go through that as a parent and ask yourself. You can sit down with your spouse, read the duty, and just ask, have we done that? Have we done that? And many of the things that Catholic parents think that they're supposed to do are often above and beyond what their duties actually are. And they torment themselves with a task list that really isn't true. And that's one of the reasons why they struggle. They don't have that clear conscience that we read of when we read about this farmer caring for this vineyard. And if you don't have the true list of duties, you might torment yourself forever. At the same time, if you don't have that list of duties, you might also have duties on that list that you have not fulfilled. And you're seeing the effects of those neglected duties. But as I went through them in the video that we made, it's pretty clear, I would say, that most faithful Catholic parents do fulfill those duties. And I like to give parents a simple test. A simple test to give you some comfort. And the test is this: has the Church received your children for the sacrament of confirmation? Now, I'm not talking about confirmation in some churches where they give confirmation to young children. I'm talking about confirmation as it's normally practiced in the church, where it's given to teenagers who actually have to seek it out, have to step up, complete preparation requirements, and seek the sacrament. The Church is responsible to provide requirements for students who seek the sacrament of confirmation. They're supposed to judge whether the child has the right disposition. And if your children are received by the Church and given the sacrament of confirmation, that's a very strong sign that you have fulfilled your duties as a Catholic parent. My wife and I are about to celebrate the confirmation of our 7th child. And it's a great consolation to be able, in the presence of so many temptations and doubts and points of confusion in family life, it's a great consolation to be able to say, each of our children has been confirmed by the Church. That's a clear, positive sign that we have fulfilled our duties as Catholic parents. a good comparison to that would be my own life. As a kid, I was brought to First Communion. Then my family stopped attending church, stopped sending me to catechism classes, and I did not receive confirmation because my family stopped going to church when I was 12 or 13 years old. Well, that's not true of my children, because my wife and I have persevered in the Catholic faith and have raised our children to observe the precepts of the Church, to live the Catholic life. And that's a source of consolation. But still, we watch as our children grow up and enter into their adult independence. And I just did a talk about this that I recommend. The talk is titled, "Are Catholic Kids Really Leaving the Church?" Because I think that this is a much more complex issue in America than we allow it to be. I think we use the decisions of our young adult children as something of a criticism of the church, or criticism of parents, or criticism of schools, when it's clear that that's really not what's happening. And these parables we're reading today, the parable in the gospel and the illustration of the vineyard from the prophet Isaiah, perfectly refute this idea that if someone makes a bad decision, that's proof that the cultivation, as it were bad. That's obviously not taught in sacred scripture. And I think that there's something more complicated going on in the lives of many of our young adult children because of this confusing culture of religious freedom, freedom of speech, and so on. I think our kids have to flap their wings a little bit as young adults and really make the decision for themselves to commit to the Catholic Church as adults. And we see them go through that process. And I believe some misinterpret it. I explained that, like I said in that talk, are Catholic kids leaving the Catholic Church? I don't think they are. But we can have consolation. And again, I'm not giving this like everybody's right, everybody's good message, because that's not true. I'm saying there are objective duties of Catholic parents, just like there are objective tasks for one who would grow grapes. We can make a list of those tasks. We can go through that list. We can check off those tasks and know with some certainty that we have fulfilled them because they're measurable, as all duties must be. And again, I've laid all those out in that article on the duties of Catholic parents. But we see this in today's readings, and it's a source of comfort for us to see that just as we share in fatherhood with God in a different sphere, as we share in fatherhood, we also share in the sorrows and in the joys of that fatherhood. Jesus teaches us, for example, that there is rejoicing in heaven when one sinner repents. And we can think of that spiritual joy that is had in heaven, and we can imagine, or we may even experience, that joy in our own circles. To see a child make a bad decision, head down a bad path, and then come back. That's a very special grace to be able to celebrate that joy. Or just to see a child make good decisions. And to go to bed at night as a parent pleased and happy, with no stress or concern for that child. We see God telling us that He has those same experiences in some, obviously some spiritual sense. Not in the same sense that we do, but similarly, analogously, comparably. And that's important for us to realize. There are many times where we enter into a situation as parents where there's sort of a popular wisdom on how to respond to this situation or that situation, or there's just a selfish, carnal instinct for how to respond. And if we reflect on the history of God's dealing with His people, or God's dealing with us, we see that the divine, the godly response is not that of the popular wisdom, not that of the parenting magazine, not that necessarily of your parish friends. It may be a really challenging response that requires you to take up the cross and sacrifice and love, laying down your own life and your own benefits for others. Anytime I experience some bad relationship, or even a bad event in a relationship, I obviously have a very happy marriage with my wife, who I've been with since I was a teenager. But there are times even in our relationship where I'll get frustrated or upset about something and just be walking around the house grumpy. And as I think critically about my wife, one thing I've always found helpful in getting me out of that mindset, and I'm talking about a situation where my wife may be doing something that's really wrong, that I'm justly upset about. If I think in that situation of how I do the same thing to God, it puts it all in perspective. It helps me to think of how God responds to me in that situation and allows me to be an imitator of God and how I respond to that situation. And often there are two different options. Option one, is eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I'm going to demand that my wife respond in the right way. But it's very rare that God ever responds with that method. God often gives more grace. And we often find that there's another option for how to deal with a situation, and many of those situations can simply be covered by love. And that's really the challenge of imitating God, is learning just how much disobedience and unfaithfulness He simply covers. He just absorbs with His own love. And that's what Jesus talked about when he said, he who is forgiven much loves much. That's actually what leads us to love God, is that experience, not of him demanding that we pay what we owe, not of him demanding that we act a certain way, but by him simply forgiving and covering our faults with his own love, like the Father receiving the prodigal son. So by studying this analogy that exists between our relationships and God's relationships, we learn to think rightly about God and to think rightly about ourselves. We learn to be imitators of God, and we actually enjoy the joy of living in that fellowship with God by imitating him. But what I really want to stress today is the consolation or comfort that today's readings give us as Catholic parents, to know that it's perfectly true that we may have done everything that we were supposed to do. We may be able to look at our children, how we raised them, what we taught them, how we lived before them, and we may say, as God himself says, what else was I supposed to do? What more could I have done that I did not do? And the true answer may be nothing. There's nothing else that you could have done. There's nothing else that you could do. The problem is not in you. The problem is in the vine. And that's reality. And we see that in God himself, in his dealing with men. And that understanding can actually be a help in our relationships. It can help us not to become miserable and frustrated. It can help us to know that we just have to keep on doing what we're doing and understand that the results are not in our control. And we can do so with a clear conscience, with peace of mind. We can have good relationships with our children, even though we know that we're not receiving the fruit that we desire. We understand that it's really more complicated than that. And just because we desire certain fruit, it's not an automatic process. It's not a machine where if you put a coin into the machine, the product comes out. It's not a vending machine, if you will. It's much more complicated because we've got a vending machine with free will operating, and we've got a machine that's operating under the influence of many other factors, not just our own influence. So I hope that you take some time to read today's Mass readings, reflect on them, and think about how they offer consolation for Catholic parents. I hope that's helpful. God bless.